October 1956. The world stood on the edge of another global catastrophe. Only 11 years had passed since the guns of World War II had fallen silent, yet a new crisis was about to shake the balance of power. This time, the battlefield was not Berlin, Normandy, or Stalingrad. It was a narrow strip of water cutting through the deserts of Egypt, the Suez Canal. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary waterway. But appearances were deceiving. This canal carried nearly two-thirds of Europe's oil. Every day, hundreds of ships crossed its waters carrying fuel, weapons, food, and trade worth billions. Whoever controlled the canal held enormous influence over the global economy. For almost a century, Britain and France had dominated this lifeline. To them, the Suez Canal was not simply a canal. It was the artery of an empire. Without it, Britain's connection to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East would weaken dramatically. But a young Egyptian leader had other plans. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Only a few years earlier, Egypt had overthrown its monarchy. Nasser emerged as the symbol of Arab nationalism, promising that Egypt would never again live under foreign control. He believed one thing above all else: a truly independent nation could never allow outsiders to control its greatest national asset. Then came the decision that shocked the world. On July 26, 1956, standing before thousands of cheering supporters in Alexandria, Nasser announced that Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal Company. The crowd erupted. For Egyptians, it was a declaration of independence. For Britain and France, it was a declaration of war. Within hours, government offices in London and Paris entered emergency meetings. Maps covered the tables. Military commanders were summoned. Secret intelligence files were opened. The British Prime Minister feared that if Egypt succeeded, Britain's remaining influence across the Middle East would collapse. French leaders feared something else. They accused Nasser of supporting anti-colonial rebels fighting French forces in Algeria. To Paris, removing Nasser became a strategic necessity. But openly invading Egypt carried enormous risks. The United States opposed colonial wars. The Soviet Union watched every move. The United Nations demanded diplomacy. So Britain and France searched for another solution. Secretly, far from public attention. Meanwhile, another nation watched events closely. Israel. Since its creation in 1948, Israel and Egypt had fought bitter wars. Egypt blocked Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran. Cross-border attacks increased. Tension grew every month. For Israeli leaders, Nasser's growing military strength looked increasingly dangerous. Suddenly, three countries shared the same objective. Britain wanted control of the canal. France wanted to weaken Nasser. Israel wanted to eliminate a regional threat. What followed became one of the most secret diplomatic conspiracies of the 20th century. Late in October 1956, representatives from all three countries met in complete secrecy at Sèvres, near Paris. No journalists, no official announcements, no public records. Behind closed doors, they drafted a plan. Israel would invade Egypt first. Britain and France would then demand that both sides withdraw from the canal zone. Egypt would reject the ultimatum. Britain and France would use that refusal as an excuse to invade and seize the canal. To the world, it would appear as a peacekeeping operation. In reality, every step had already been planned. The agreement remained hidden for years. Even many government officials had no idea it existed. As diplomats finalized their strategy, soldiers quietly prepared for war. British aircraft moved toward Mediterranean bases. French naval forces assembled. Israeli armored divisions gathered in the Negev desert. Thousands of young soldiers cleaned rifles, loaded ammunition, checked radios, and waited for orders they could not discuss with anyone. Across Egypt, ordinary citizens had little idea how close their nation stood to invasion. In Cairo, cafes remained busy. Markets overflowed with merchants. Children walked to school. Ships continued moving through the canal as if nothing had changed. Yet behind the scenes, intelligence agencies intercepted unusual military movements. Reports crossed government desks. Warnings accumulated. Some believed war was inevitable. Others hoped diplomacy would prevail. Neither side truly understood how quickly events were about to spiral beyond control. At the center of it all stood one narrow canal, less than 200 kilometers long, that suddenly held the attention of every major power on Earth. Because this was never just about Egypt. It was about empire, prestige, power, and the question that haunted every colonial nation after World War II. Could old empires still dictate the future? Or had a new world already arrived? The answer would come through explosions, diplomacy, betrayal, and one of the greatest political humiliations in modern British history. The countdown had begun. Within days, tanks would cross deserts. Paratroopers would descend from dark skies. Warships would bombard Egyptian positions. And behind every military operation lay a secret agreement that almost no one outside a handful of leaders knew existed. The Suez Crisis had begun. The final orders were issued during the last days of October 1956. Every unit already knew its objective. Every commander understood the timetable. Every movement had been carefully synchronized. On the evening of 29 October 1956, the first stage of the operation began. Israeli paratroopers descended into the Sinai Desert near the Mitla Pass. Transport aircraft disappeared into the darkness as hundreds of soldiers landed far behind Egyptian lines. At the same time, armored columns crossed the border. Dust clouds stretched across the desert as tanks, armored vehicles, and supply trucks advanced toward Egyptian positions. Within hours, the Middle East was once again at war. News spread rapidly. Radio Cairo announced that Israeli forces had invaded Egyptian territory. Citizens gathered around radios. Military headquarters activated emergency plans. President Gamal Abdel Nasser immediately ordered a full defensive response. Egyptian commanders rushed troops toward the Sinai. Fighter aircraft prepared for combat. Bridges were secured. Defensive positions were reinforced. Exactly as planned, Britain and France acted. But not as allies of Israel. At least that was the story they told the world. London and Paris issued an ultimatum demanding that both Egypt and Israel stop fighting and withdraw from the Suez Canal zone. On paper, it appeared neutral. In reality, the ultimatum had been written knowing Egypt could never accept it. Accepting would have meant surrendering control of its own territory to foreign powers. Nasser rejected it immediately. That rejection became the excuse Britain and France had been waiting for. On 31 October, British and French aircraft launched massive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. The skies filled with bombers and fighter jets. Explosions erupted across military bases. Runways cracked beneath repeated attacks. Hangars burned. Dozens of Egyptian aircraft were destroyed before they could even leave the ground. Within days, Egypt's air force had been severely weakened. Control of the skies shifted to the invading coalition. Yet Nasser refused to surrender. Instead, he made a decision that stunned military planners. If Egypt could not hold the canal, no one would use it. Orders were given to block the Suez Canal. Old ships were deliberately sunk in strategic locations. Cargo vessels were scuttled. Navigation channels became impassable. The world's busiest shipping route suddenly fell silent. International trade slowed dramatically. Oil prices immediately began rising. European governments realized the crisis threatened far more than Egypt. It threatened the global economy. Meanwhile, the fighting intensified across the Sinai. Israeli armored divisions advanced with remarkable speed. Several Egyptian defensive positions collapsed. Roads filled with military vehicles moving in opposite directions. Smoke rose from destroyed tanks. Artillery echoed across the desert. Entire villages emptied as civilians fled the advancing front lines. Then came the next phase. British and French naval forces approached the Egyptian coast. Warships positioned themselves offshore. Marines prepared landing craft. Elite paratroopers checked their equipment one final time. On 5 November, thousands of British and French airborne troops descended near Port Said. The city erupted into chaos. Machine gun fire echoed through the streets. Buildings shook from artillery impacts. Smoke covered entire neighborhoods. Egyptian soldiers fought fiercely despite overwhelming firepower. Street by street, building by building, the battle became brutal. Civilians found themselves trapped between advancing troops and collapsing defenses. Hospitals quickly filled with casualties. Families searched desperately for missing relatives. Electricity failed in many areas. Communication lines were cut. The sounds of explosions continued day and night. Despite the coalition's military success, something unexpected was happening thousands of kilometers away. Washington. The White House had been watching every development. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had not approved the invasion. In fact, he was furious. The United States had spent years presenting itself as the defender of freedom and self-determination during the Cold War. Supporting what looked like an old-style colonial invasion would damage America's credibility across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Eisenhower demanded an immediate ceasefire. British leaders assumed America would eventually support its closest ally. They were wrong. Instead of military assistance, Washington applied enormous political and financial pressure. Behind closed doors, American officials warned Britain that its economy could suffer severe consequences if the invasion continued. For Prime Minister Anthony Eden, the situation became a nightmare. British troops were advancing, yet the country's most powerful ally opposed the operation. As if that were not enough, another superpower entered the crisis: the Soviet Union. Moscow condemned the invasion immediately. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev issued harsh warnings. He accused Britain, France, and Israel of aggression. Some statements even hinted that the Soviet Union might consider direct military intervention if the attacks continued. Whether those threats would ever have been carried out remains debated by historians. But during those tense days, many feared the crisis could spiral into a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Suddenly, the invasion of Egypt was no longer simply a regional war. It had become one of the most dangerous international crises of the Cold War. In New York, the United Nations held emergency meetings. Delegates from around the world demanded immediate action. Smaller nations watched carefully. Many had only recently gained independence from colonial rule. To them, the Suez Crisis represented something much larger. Would powerful countries still be allowed to invade weaker nations whenever their interests were threatened? Or had international law truly changed after World War II? The answer would determine the future of global politics. Military victories on the battlefield suddenly mattered less than political pressure in world capitals. Britain and France had expected a quick triumph. Instead, they found themselves increasingly isolated. The operation that seemed perfectly planned was beginning to unravel. By the first week of November 1956, the military campaign appeared to be succeeding. British and French forces had secured key positions around Port Said. Israeli troops had advanced rapidly across much of the Sinai Peninsula. On paper, victory looked almost certain. But wars are not won on paper. They are won by politics, economics, and public opinion as much as by soldiers. And in all three, Britain and France were beginning to lose. Across the world, newspapers carried dramatic photographs of burning Egyptian cities, damaged homes, and frightened civilians. Television, still a relatively new medium, brought the crisis directly into living rooms. Public opinion shifted quickly. Many people questioned why two European powers were once again invading an independent nation. The image of Britain as a defender of democracy suffered a serious blow. Inside the United Nations, debates grew more intense. Delegates from Asia, Africa, and Latin America condemned the invasion. Even countries that disagreed with Nasser believed that changing borders by force would create a dangerous precedent. The pressure mounted hour by hour. Then came the greatest shock. The United States decided to use its economic power against its closest ally. Britain depended heavily on international confidence in the British pound. As financial markets became nervous, investors began selling pounds at an alarming rate. The value of Britain's currency started falling. The British government urgently needed American financial support. Instead, Washington refused to help unless Britain agreed to stop the invasion. It was an extraordinary moment in modern history. The nation that had once ruled the largest empire on Earth now found itself unable to continue a military operation without American approval. Prime Minister Anthony Eden faced an impossible choice: continue fighting or protect Britain's collapsing economy. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Egyptian resistance continued despite heavy losses. Although many military positions had been overrun, Egyptian soldiers, police units, and volunteers fought fiercely in the streets. Port Said became a symbol of resistance. Snipers fired from damaged buildings. Barricades appeared across narrow roads. Every block became another obstacle for advancing troops. For local civilians, daily life had completely collapsed. Food became scarce. Clean water was difficult to find. Hospitals operated beyond capacity. Entire families sheltered in basements while artillery shells exploded overhead. The fear was constant. No one knew whether the next explosion would strike their neighborhood. President Nasser understood that even if Egypt lost territory temporarily, surviving politically would be enough. His speeches were broadcast across the Arab world. He declared that Egypt would never surrender its sovereignty. Millions listened. From Morocco to Iraq, many people saw him not simply as Egypt's leader, but as the voice of Arab independence. Ironically, every bomb dropped by Britain and France strengthened his popularity. Instead of destroying his influence, the invasion transformed him into a hero. Across the Middle East, demonstrations erupted. Crowds carried Egyptian flags. British and French embassies increased security. Governments watched anxiously as public anger spread. Then another dramatic development changed everything. The United Nations proposed creating a completely new kind of military force. Instead of choosing sides, this force would separate the opposing armies and supervise a ceasefire. It became the United Nations Emergency Force, the first large-scale peacekeeping mission in UN history. The idea was revolutionary. Rather than allowing powerful nations to dictate peace, an international organization would help enforce it. Pressure became unbearable. On 6 November 1956, Britain and France announced a ceasefire. The guns gradually fell silent. For soldiers still on the front lines, the order came almost unexpectedly. Many had believed the campaign would continue. Instead, operations stopped. Israeli forces remained in occupied positions for the time being, but diplomatic negotiations quickly began over withdrawal. Across Britain, reactions were mixed. Some believed the government had surrendered under foreign pressure. Others believed ending the conflict had prevented a much larger disaster. Prime Minister Anthony Eden faced severe criticism. His health deteriorated under enormous stress. Within weeks, he resigned from office. His political career was effectively over. For Britain, the consequences reached far beyond one prime minister. The Suez Crisis exposed a painful truth. Britain was no longer the world's dominant superpower. That role had passed to the United States and the Soviet Union. The age of the British Empire was ending. France reached a similar conclusion. Its leaders became increasingly determined to develop an independent military and foreign policy, including building their own nuclear deterrent. Israel, despite withdrawing later under international pressure, gained valuable military experience and demonstrated the effectiveness of its armed forces. But the greatest political winner was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Although Egypt had suffered military setbacks, he emerged stronger than ever. He retained control of the Suez Canal. His prestige throughout the Arab world soared. What Britain and France had intended as a display of strength had become a symbol of their declining influence. The crisis had lasted only a matter of days. Its consequences would shape international politics for decades. The fighting had ended. The smoke slowly drifted away from Port Said. Warships began leaving Egyptian waters. Soldiers packed their equipment. The headlines changed. But history was only beginning to understand what had really happened. At first glance, the Suez Crisis looked like a short military conflict that lasted only a few weeks. Yet historians would later argue that its true battlefield was never the Sinai Desert. It was the balance of global power. For centuries, Britain had ruled over the largest empire in human history. Its navy controlled the seas. Its colonies stretched across continents. Its influence reached nearly every corner of the globe. There had once been a saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But after Suez, that saying no longer reflected reality. The crisis exposed a painful truth. Britain could no longer wage a major international military operation without the approval of the United States. Military strength alone was no longer enough. Economic power had become the new weapon. Washington had demonstrated that a country's currency, financial markets, and international loans could decide the outcome of a war just as effectively as tanks and aircraft. It was a lesson every government would remember. France also reached a turning point. French leaders believed they had relied too heavily on foreign support. If France wanted to remain an independent global power, it needed stronger military capabilities. Within a few years, France accelerated the development of its own nuclear weapons program. The Suez Crisis had reshaped French strategy for generations. For Egypt, the story was completely different. Although thousands had suffered during the fighting, the political result exceeded even Nasser's expectations. The Suez Canal remained under Egyptian control. Foreign ownership was finished. For millions across Africa and Asia, Nasser became proof that former colonies could challenge old empires and survive. His speeches echoed from Cairo to Jakarta. His image appeared on newspapers across the Arab world. Young independence movements saw him as a symbol of national dignity. The crisis inspired leaders in countries still struggling against colonial rule. Across Africa, independence movements gained momentum. Within just a few years, dozens of new nations emerged. The world map began changing rapidly. Empires that had existed for centuries started disappearing. Many historians now describe Suez as the moment when European colonial dominance entered its final chapter. The United Nations also emerged transformed. For the first time, an international peacekeeping force had separated hostile armies. The success of the United Nations Emergency Force created a new model for future conflicts. In the decades that followed, UN peacekeepers would deploy to crisis zones around the world. Another silent winner was the Soviet Union. Although it never entered the battlefield, Moscow used the crisis to strengthen its influence throughout the Middle East. The Soviet Union offered economic aid, military equipment, and diplomatic support to Egypt and other Arab nations. Cold War competition spread deeper into the region. The Middle East became one of the world's most important geopolitical battlegrounds. The United States also learned valuable lessons. American leaders realized that stability in the Middle East was directly connected to global oil supplies and international security. From that point onward, Washington became increasingly involved in regional politics. Many of the alliances, military bases, and diplomatic strategies that still shape the Middle East today can be traced back to decisions made after the Suez Crisis. The canal itself eventually reopened. International shipping resumed. Oil tankers once again crossed the narrow waterway linking Europe and Asia. Trade recovered, but the psychological impact never disappeared. For Britain, Suez became a word associated with national humiliation. Political leaders studied every mistake. Military academies analyzed the campaign. Historians debated whether the invasion had been doomed from the beginning. Some argued the operation was militarily successful but politically disastrous. Others believed it should never have been attempted at all. One fact, however, remained beyond dispute. After Suez, the world recognized that the era of European imperial dominance had come to an end. Power had shifted. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood at the center of global affairs. The Cold War, not colonial empires, would define the second half of the 20th century. Today, ships still pass through the Suez Canal every day. Nearly 12% of global trade continues to move through this narrow waterway. Every vessel crossing its waters is a reminder of a conflict that lasted only days but changed international politics forever. The Suez Crisis was never simply about Egypt. It was about pride, influence, national identity, and the realization that history does not always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to the nation that refuses to surrender its sovereignty. When historians search for the exact moment the British Empire finally accepted that its age was over, many point to 1 year. 1956. One canal. One crisis. One decision that permanently changed the balance of world power. The Suez Crisis was more than a war. It was the moment an empire discovered that history had already moved on. End of script.